What's going on, guys? It's Parker back with a new video, and today we're gonna not be playing a game. This is gonna be my first, and hopefully first of a lot of alternate history scenarios. So I watch a lot of alternate history on YouTube, and I decided I'm gonna try it myself. So we're gonna see how this goes. This is an alternate history on what if Lenin was killed during the Russian Civil War. So, we start here with Vladimir Lenin, the first leader of the Soviet Union. Lenin was a very, very interesting man, as he could be very rude and irritable, but he was also very patriotic and could easily rally his troops to win the battle. And Lenin's death in real life was due to a number of strokes in 1924. He also previously been attempted to almost assassinated 10 times, the most famous of which was that he was at a factory he was speaking at, a member of the Social Revolutionary Party named Fanya Kaplan, and I'm not going to make a Jeff Kaplan joke here. Anyway, she shot him twice, he survived, and the Bolsheviks cracked down on the social revolutionaries. That is not important to anything that's going on in this video, though. So, our point of departure is during the Battle of Tsaritsyn during the Russian Civil War. Tsaritsyn is what is now Volgograd, and what was during World War II, Stalingrad. So, kind of an important city to the Soviets. And then Lenin showed up there to rally the troops to win this battle. And at that point in time, the communists were losing the Civil War. But Lenin rallied the troops, and they were able to win the battle and eventually win the Civil War. Most of the credit to this battle does go to Stalin, and it should. He disobeyed commands from Moscow to win made his own orders, and that's how the communists won the battle. Stalin rallied the troops, and that's why the city was named Stalingrad in his honor in 1925, because that was his, I guess, greatest victory militarily. So in this alternate timeline, a stray bullet or an artillery shell misses its target and will kill Lenin. In my opinion, this will result in two equally possible timelines. Either the first one, the revolution completely falls apart and the constitutional monarchy is established in Russia, which is essentially a what if the Bolsheviks failed timeline. And I won't be making that video because What If Alt Hist has a great video on that. Link will be in the description. The video I'm making will be based on the unlikely event that the death of Lenin results in a rally of Bolshevik pride, nationalism, faith in the revolution, and lust for revenge to avenge his death. Your first question is, who takes over for Lenin? It would almost certainly be Trotsky. He led the Red Army and was very, very involved with the Civil War. The troops would see him as their leader, and therefore he would take power with the military supporting him, which during a Civil War would usually lead to a very high-ranking general taking the lead, which he would. With Trotsky in charge, the Civil War would probably end up being the same, with the Reds winning and expanding the borders to what they were before World War II, annexing, I believe, Belarusia or Belarus, Ukraine, and the Caucasus states, so Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Now, the Soviets would still lose the Polish-Soviet War of 1920 as the Russians were caught off guard, and the Polish troops advanced almost unopposed at a lot of points. Almost halfway through Ukraine. The Russians would sue for peace, and the Polish would gain the territory that they did after the war. And the Civil War would end around the same time, I believe it was 1922, as the death of Lenin could not change the amount of Soviet manpower and the amount of equipment that the soldiers used. Also, the skill of military leadership wouldn't change. If anything, it might end later, because after the death of Lenin, there would be a little bit of a free-for-all to see who's going to take over the Soviet Union. So, maybe add a couple months on to the end of the Russian Civil War. Now, Trotsky was a very, very different man from Stalin. Trotsky was way more in your face, he was way more aggressive, whereas Stalin would fund a communist insurgency and rebels in your country, fund the rebels, where Trotsky would just flat out invade the country. This would lead to a very, very different and way more aggressive foreign policy held by the Soviet Union. Western Europe, it would be very similar. The West would end up fearing the Soviets like they did, and communism would be the main priority to get rid of before fascism and the Nazis. Hitler would still gain power, and the Anschluss would still occur. But now appeasement would be the same, but also kind of different. Chamberlain would appease Hitler, but it would be more of a, let's try and rearm Germany to fight off the communists kind of thing. Because the Western Allies didn't see fascism as much of a problem as they did communism. Because at least in the UK, the leading faction was a conservative right-wing party, so they saw the Soviets as the main enemy. Which obviously didn't happen, because Nazis happened. But World War II would start very similarly to how it did, but it would start with more of a Soviet invasion of either Finland, the Baltics, or Poland. It would even be similar to our timeline with Trotsky annexing, say, the Baltics and parts of Finland, like annexing Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia. And then he would probably, and then ironically, France, Germany, and Britain would draw the line with Poland, offering the Poles a guarantee of independence and support if the Soviets invaded. Germany potentially offering their guarantee in exchange of former Prussian lands, including Danzig. Poland would be probably the main battleground of the Second World War, at least in Europe, with Russian hordes running at German panzers and armor. Slowly but surely, the Western coalition would probably push the Soviets back into Russia, and probably into Ukraine and Belarus, probably with the help of Mussolini and maybe Franco. I doubt Franco, because obviously the Civil War, or the Spanish Civil War, had just ended, so Spain was kind of in a bit of a disarray. But Mussolini would probably help out, because he would support Hitler. But I'm not sure how the Russo-Japanese relations would be, with them being very, the Russo-Japanese relations in our timeline, they didn't like each other very much. And probably similar here. It might be worse here, actually, as Manchuria would be a very contested area between the two powers, and Japan would still invade China, probably the Philippines, and the Indonesian islands. This would get a war between the US, Britain, and to a lesser extent the Dutch versus the Japanese. Maybe seeing this, the Russians would invade Manchuria, probably early into the war with the West, because Trotsky would probably be pushing through Poland, maybe even occupying some of Ostprussian. And that's when he would probably invade Manchuria then, coming out of, and Korea as well, coming out of Vladivostok. But the Japanese would eventually halt them somewhat, and then the Germans would arrive in Poland, and then the French, and then eventually the British. And in terms of air power, the Soviets would have no chance against the Luftwaffe, the British, the RAF, and to even some extent the French Air Force. It was not the worst in our timeline, but the Soviets would have no chance between those three air forces. So it wouldn't really be that close of a war. It would just be the fact that the Russians would be able to hold they would be taking millions upon millions of casualties, but they would be able to hold at least somewhat against the Western coalition. Japan would likely hold Manchuria and China, but would inevitably lose to the US in the Pacific Islands, as there's just no chance whatsoever that the Japanese could beat the Americans without using crazy tactics, the Americans being flat out stupid, and the Japanese getting super lucky. And I do believe with the Japanese occupied Manchuria, the Americans have a way easier time in the Pacific, so the Pacific will probably end around late to mid-1944, or late 1943 to mid-1944. With the Soviets occupied, Chiang Kai-shek would crush Mao Zedong in China. The communists in China would have no chance, and China would be far more advanced in 2020 in this timeline, with help from the Western powers, as the US would send help, probably the British and the French would also send help to the Chinese in China to crush the communists, and the Russians would not be able to spare any troops, any guns, any planes to go help out the communists in China. After the war, the Soviets would probably use a bit of territory to the Germans, probably some parts of Poland, and maybe even parts of the Baltic states. And some sort of democracy would be put in power in the country, potentially being some sort of authoritarian democracy being put in power in Russia. And the British and French would stay powerful colonial powers, because the French wouldn't have surrendered, and the British wouldn't, and the Americans wouldn't see the need for the British to decolonize, as the Americans would not have had much, would not have done as much in the war in Europe. That would have been mostly the colonial powers of France and Britain. The British and the French would stay powerful, and the US would be more of a regional power in the American Pacific, so the Americans would be probably putting power in East Asia as well, with Japan, and probably even, and then obviously the just Pacific Islands, and then South America. The Americans would not be as interventionist, but they would always intervene in South America and Central America if they had to. A type of Cold War would probably pop up between Britain, France, China, and Russia, and potentially the US, versus Germany, Italy, and a rebuilt Spain, so essentially the democracies versus the fascists. I can't really foresee how this would turn out because both sides would be very, very equally matched, with the French and the British being even more powerful than they would be. The French and British would be tip-top shape, very, very powerful. And then Germany and then Hitler would have a lot more time to consolidate power. And even if Hitler dies early, then that could end up being a German civil war, which would completely negate most of the Cold War, as Germany would be the leading power against the Chinese and the British and the Russians. I mean, the Western coalition of Britain, France, China, and Russia, not really Western because of China and Russia, but the democracies would be very, very powerful, and Italy and Spain would have to fight if a war did break out to their max. And I don't see them winning if a fight would turn out. The only way that the fascists would win was if they had a far bigger nuclear arsenal. But with China, Russia, Britain, and France, I don't see that happening. I see if a war would happen, of a Cold War between those countries happening, and a war would break out, like a Third World War, Britain, France, China, and Russia would dominate. It wouldn't really be that close. I imagine an invasion into the French. The French would be very, very tough to defend. I mean, you have to defend from the Pyrenees, the Alps, and the Maginot, or Alsace-Lorraine. So it would be a very defensive war for the British and the French, while the Russians pushed on from the east with help of Chinese troops. That's what I think would probably happen. And eventually the fascist coalition would just break down, maybe with some insurgents or a civil war breaking out in one of the countries. So that's where I think would happen if Lenin was killed, potentially. So thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'm going to see you guys later. Goodbye!